talk about audience, we are all participants. So you consider yourself active participants in this session.
Like you're going to call on them, aren't you?
Yes.
Now, the title is quite complex, Multi-Stakeholder Governance of the Domain Name System, Lessons Learned for Other Internet Governance Issues. And there are a series of questions that have been given to us. And the first question is an explanation of how the domain name system is governed in a multi-stakeholder manner. One of our panelists who is not here yet, Laurie Schulman, had actually volunteered to take on this question. And I thought yesterday that might be an easy question, as we all know how it works, but actually the prep session with the panelists showed it may be that we have different views on how it works. So let's see how it goes. I will not introduce the panelists. I think most people in the room know them all, but I will ask each of them when they take the floor to introduce themselves briefly. And as Laurie is not here, Keith Dashek, who sits next to me, volunteered to give it a go with the first question. Please, Keith.
Okay, good morning. So good morning, everybody. My name is Keith Drazek. I work for VeriSign. I'm involved in the ICANN space primarily in the registry stakeholder group. So since most of us in the room are familiar, and some of us intimately familiar with ICANN and the sort of the multi-stakeholder structure within ICANN, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but for those who may be watching remotely, may not be familiar, just give a brief overview. So the management of the domain name system within ICANN is set up in a number of different structures. There is primarily the GTLD, or the generic top-level domain space, and the country code namespace, so the CCNSO. So the two different groups in those areas, the generic name supporting organization and the CCNSO, the country code name supporting organization, are the policy-making bodies within ICANN focusing on the domain name space. And specifically within the generic namespace, the GNSO, there are many, many different stakeholders. Within that space, there are two houses. Within that organization, there are two houses, the contracted party house that is comprised of registries and registrars. Registries are essentially the wholesalers of domain names, the master database of all second-level names, and the registrars are the channel or the retail points of purchase for a domain name. So the contracted party house are those entities that have contracts with ICANN for the sale and management of domain names. The non-contracted party house includes essentially everyone else, which has commercial interests, non-commercial interests, business, intellectual property, user interests, and the range of different participants. And it is, and I'll just focus specifically on the GNSO for right now. The GNSO is responsible for policy making through something called a policy development process, which is a process that is explicitly included in ICANN's bylaws, and that is a mechanism by which the community, the broader community, can impact the policies around domain names and essentially the contracts that registries and registrars have with ICANN. So it is, in a sense, one of the grand bargains was that a recognition that contracted parties, registries and registrars and ICANN, recognize that through a formal process called a PDP, there is the opportunity for the rest of the community in a multi-stakeholder engagement to impact the policies, the procedures, and essentially the contracts that govern our industry. So this is, I think, what we're here to talk about today, and I think we'll talk about some of the, the positive experiences, some of the challenges that we've seen and that we currently and continue to see, and I look forward to a robust discussion. So Marcus, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them, but maybe we can move on.
Thank you, Keith. That was a very succinct explanation of how the ICANN universe works. I wonder whether any of... My apologies, I thought I had pressed the button. Well, I thanked Keith for a very succinct presentation and asked whether other panelists would like to add a perspective, but also participants from the floor are welcome to chime in if they would like to add anything. If not, we don't need to extend. Yes, Olivier would like to add something, please.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. Olivier Crépin-Blanc speaking. Just to add that the process is open for everyone to take part in, which is particularly important. There is no barrier to participation on this. Thank you.
Thank you. That's, I think, an important addition, but I think we come also to that from a newcomer's point of view. Grace would then like to talk to that maybe at a later stage a bit. And we also have a video. Our panelists sent us a video. She's not able to attend remotely, but she also addresses an issue of newcomers. I mean, it is open, but are there barriers to entry? That's a question. Other points? If not, we can move on. We have given a lengthy scenario for our session, and I think a centerpiece of that is the ANA transition, and the spiel that is on the website says it's perhaps the best example of a complex policy negotiation with a concrete result being managed by a group of different stakeholders. And many in this room were very active participants in this process, but I would like to call on the mastermind behind the transition, if not the godfather of the transition, Larry Strickling, who then in the position of the US government really drove the stakeholders to come to a result. Please, Larry, give your take on the ANA transition and also address the question whether it can be applied to other internet governance process, please.
So first, everything you just said about my role was not true. We were the catalyst in the United States government to get the multi-stakeholder community to step up, but very quickly the stakeholders in the community took on that responsibility and organized themselves and conducted and I do agree with the assessment in the program that this has been the most successful demonstration of a large-scale multi-stakeholder process that's ever occurred. And it helped that it had the resources of ICANN behind it in terms of facilitating convening and certainly legal representation by many parties. But it was truly the stakeholders who did the work on this. And in large part, the role of the United States government, after requesting the community to come together to develop the transition plan, was to sit back and watch and nudge where appropriate, which fortunately didn't occur very often. But it's really a tribute to the work of stakeholders from all of these various sectors of the internet economy that delivered the transition plan, both for the technical functions as well as the larger scale and scope accountability work that the community sought to do. In fact, it's interesting to note that at the time of we announced the intent to go forward with the transition in 2014, the United States government did not even ask at that time for the accountability work, but it very quickly, within weeks, the community stepped up and said, well, it's not enough just to have a technical plan. There really needs to be attention given to the accountability issues. And we quickly embraced that and felt that that was important to allow the community to go forward with that piece of it. But that was something that was generated by the community and not by us in the United States government. So again, there are lots of veterans of that effort sitting in the audience, so I don't need to belabor it, and others may want to comment on it in terms of what they found critical and what they found important in the effort. But I'd like to maybe step past that. We're now in 2017, almost 2018. It's been a year now since the transition occurred, and the question is, how do we take that success of the multi-stakeholder approach and the demonstration that it made for the 2 years it was involved in developing the transition plan and look to expand that process? The ICANN structure, while complicated, as Keith pointed out, I think still comes down to some basic concepts. And all of these, I think, are characteristic of an appropriate multi-stakeholder approach to solving problems. Needs to be stakeholder-driven. And again, I think as I just said, the bringing in the accountability issues into the IANA transition is an example of something that was very much stakeholder-driven. The other, I think, general concepts that you want to see applied to any application of multi-stakeholder approaches is the need for openness. Openness both in terms of conducting its proceedings openly, but also in terms of allowing participation by any interested party. Another hallmark of multi-stakeholder approaches, the successful ones, is the transparency so that people can see what's being discussed. I can't remember the statistics any longer. I used to be able to spout them off at the drop of a hat in terms of the thousands of emails that went on to lists during the IANA transition, the number of conference calls that were all duly recorded and archived, the public meetings that were held on it. I see Steve Del Bianco laughing because he's probably one of the few people who read every one of those emails. But that's very important in terms of giving people the confidence that the process is truly an open one and is respectful of the viewpoints of all parties. And then what's absolutely critical in all this is that the need for the outcomes to be consensus-based. Now, consensus can take a variety of definitions, but at the end of the day, it's important that the group that's working come to some sense of consensus in their own minds as a way of validating and moving forward. So these are, I think, universal concepts. They clearly are present in the ICANN model, but I think they have more general applicability. And to the question that Mark has put to us of, so how do we go forward from and take these learnings of the IANA transition to do more with multi-stakeholder approaches. It's something that I personally have spent a lot of time with here in the last 6 months. Through the auspices of the Internet Society, we've conducted a feasibility study of creating a more general capability or platform within which to conduct multi-stakeholder discussions. Because there is today, outside of the specialized organizations like ICANN and IETF and the regional internet registries that practice multi-stakeholder approaches as part of their DNA, there really is no center or in the world where these concepts are practiced and made available to communities at large. And we looked at the feasibility of doing that. And our study, which was published at the end of October, concluded after 150 interviews, many of which were of people here in the room, that creating such a capability is absolutely feasible, and in fact that there's a need for this in the internet space. And I'm pleased that the Internet Society Board has agreed to fund this project on a pilot basis next year so that we can actually prove out exactly how one could go about developing these capabilities to bring people together. So we can talk more about the specifics of that, but I think it's time to move on to some other panelists with their thoughts on this.
Yes, well, thank you, Keith. And Laurie has arrived. She was held in the queue, unfortunately, so she's a bit late, and there's no room on the panel for her, so we apologize for that. Are there any?
Sure there is. Come on up.
Well, the thing is, the chairs here are not.
Chair down the end.
Oh, there's one, yeah, okay. Are there any comments, questions to Larry? Yes, please, Matthew.
Thanks, Marcus. Matthew Shears with the ICANN board. I'd actually like to build a little bit on what Larry said. In addition to there being the importance of these characteristics of the multi-stakeholder model, there are some very important operational and buy-in elements that need to be taken into account for multi-stakeholder processes to be successful. One of the reasons why it was successful at ICANN goes without saying. It's obvious that it was a multi-stakeholder process in the first place. ICANN is a multi-stakeholder space. There's great familiarity with those processes. And this is not necessarily the case elsewhere, and there's somewhat of a lack of understanding and a lack of understanding of the complexities, in particular, of the multi-stakeholder model that needs to be better explained when it comes to looking at that model and interpreting it or placing it into different contexts. The other key factor that made it a success was that there were agreed operating principles and procedures. ICANN has a process whereby it drafts a charter, and in that charter are the goals, the leadership, the decision-making, when the process will be closed. And that clarity of purpose and procedure is incredibly important to the success of a multi-stakeholder approach. The other one is really the issue of common cause. What was clear in the transition is that the common cause was to effect the transition, but behind that were a number of guiding elements, one of which were the 4 criteria which NTIA placed on the process. The other one was also the desire, as Larry said, to see greater accountability within ICANN, and that really drove the community as a whole. And what it did is it enabled the, if you will, the subordination of the particular interests of the various parts of the community to the greater goal of seeing the transition occur. So I just wanted to add those as key elements to how multi-stakeholder processes can succeed, but it's not just the characteristics of multi-stakeholder processes, it's also the procedures and the policies that you surround them with. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Are there, yes, Laurie, please.
Good morning. I apologize for being late. I'm going to blame security for that one. But I wanted to add something about the process that Matthew described and Keith described. And to mention that what makes the multi-stakeholder process work, I think, in terms of getting to a good compromise, because it is all about compromise, and I don't know if that word has been used today yet, as I was late, but I think it is important to remember that if you stay entrenched in the process can't work, because it is consensus-driven. And then once you have that consensus, there is an implementing trigger, and that is the ICANN contracts. So when we talk about how the system works, it's important to remember that at the end of the day, there is an implementation mechanism already built in. And I know on the side of the did you talk about the 5 constituencies and, okay, the empowered community? I come from the generic name supporting organization, and within our organization, it's split as well in between contracted parties and non-contracted parties. And at times, the interests are quite at odds, and at times the interests are quite aligned. But at the end of the day, the compromise word is at the underpinning of all that we do. And I think it's very important to stress that as we talk about bringing this model to other problems. That the IANA transition, in my view, was a big compromise on very many levels. There's still a lot of unanswered questions, open questions, of how the system will work, particularly when it's tested. Particularly when there might be a moment when the community decides a budget is not a budget and rejects the budget. Or if there's an action upon the board that would somehow cause the community to question whether that board member or the board in its entirety should remain seated. And all of these processes were negotiated as part of this grand compromise for a multi-stakeholder model.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Laurie. I'd like to agree wholeheartedly with Laurie and her comments about the compromise and about how important compromise is to everything that we do in a multi-stakeholder engagement. And I would just add one of the side benefits, I think, from the IANA transition and the ICANN accountability processes that took several years from start to finish, is that it helped to break down some of the silos that existed previously within ICANN in terms of the different groups. being really focused on their own issues and focused, or as Laurie alluded to, entrenched in their positions for years and years. I think what we've seen is a far better understanding across various groups within the ICANN community of each other's positions, and frankly, relationships have been built that might not have existed before. And when you engage in a multi-stakeholder process, those relationships and the ability to understand different positions and the willingness to compromise are critical. And I think that was a key outcome from the IANA transition process. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And yes, Steve, I was just going to say there are people in the audience who were very actively involved, so I'd like to listen from them. Please.
Thank you, Marcus. Steve Del Bianco. I agree with all that's been said, and it truly was a remarkable achievement. But the compromise that Laurie just spoke of and Keith did, the compromise was enabled by a missing ingredient none of you have talked about, and that was the presence of a deadline. If we didn't have a deadline, I don't know how there would have been an incentive for the entrenched folks to compromise at all. Could have just kicked the ball down the road. And the deadline here was the end of the Obama administration, when we would lose that particular approach, and who knew what the next would be. And actually, who could have predicted what actually happened? We know now, but that presence of a deadline, if it can be brought into other multi-stakeholder experiences, can pay significant dividends, because it can drive compromise. I realize that it might cause cutting of corners. It might be suboptimal with respect to working out the details that are necessary for implementation. But the Workstream 1, Workstream 2 approach worked quite well. We're nearly finished with Workstream 2, and I think that that's where you worked out the details without having a deadline looming over your head. Thank you.
So just to put it in context, though, I agree that it's important for the community to, as a collective group, set a deadline and try to stick to it. But I want to hasten to add that I think having some external body impose a deadline is actually destructive of multi-stakeholder discussions. And for that reason, the United States government never formally imposed a deadline. It was the community who saw the looming end of the administration who felt that, gee, we really need to wrap up. And that's wonderful and that's great. And I think facts bear out the fact that was a wise decision. But indeed, when the process started in 2014, internally we thought, yeah, it'd be about a year, because the contract at that point was set to expire in September of 2015. But when it became apparent in the early summer of 2015 that the community likely wasn't going to complete its work, we then asked the community, how much more time do you want? Because we needed to extend the contract. And based on the community's statement that we can get this done in one more year, we extended the contract to September 2016. And then the community took that burden on in terms of ensuring that they got their work done in time to make that date. But again, it points out the power of doing this on a consensus basis with all stakeholders. Had the United States come out in 2014 and said, this must be done by September 2015, the process might have cratered at that point, simply because people would have been working to an artificially short deadline. So I just wanted to make that distinction.
Thank you. These are important points, and I think it wasn't so much a deadline, it was a collective recognition that there was a very narrow window of opportunity. Right. But Jordan would like to jump in.
Thanks. Thanks, Marcus. My name is Jordan Carter, .nz, and one of the things that I've had the privilege to is work with a few people in this room on the accountability track. But I wanted to make a point that wasn't quite on that. It's about this deadline idea. And really, I think the thing that made the IANA transition work is that there wasn't a plausible alternative process. And if you kind of generalize that about multi-stakeholder processes, I think they work well when a powerful stakeholder or set of stakeholders can't go around the process and get the decision they want from some other process. So in the case of the transition, you know, there was a referee, if you like, who had said this has to be a multi-stakeholder process. Here are some boundary conditions. Within that, go and do what you want to do. And the reason I raise this is I've been thinking about the application of this multi-stakeholder ethos to other processes. And the one I've done some thinking about is international trade negotiations. And the interesting thing there is that state sovereignty means that governments could be very unwilling to give up their mandate to agree trade agreements to a multi-stakeholder process. But maybe they wouldn't be unwilling to do that if they had thought the whole logic through of getting all the affected stakeholders in the room. So one of the things I think did work for IANA is that no one, it wasn't the ICANN board, the GNSO, couldn't wander outside the process and get their way around the side. Though plenty of people claimed to be doing that with you, Larry, during the course of the negotiations, which added a certain level of spice and interest as we went.
Thank you. Yes, this is also an interesting point which has come up increasingly also in the IGF context, that is trade. I think right now there's a parallel workshop on that issue, and there we have to recognize there's a long tradition of governments negotiating among themselves and usually behind closed doors, and it's difficult to break through and change the process as it has a long-established process, whereas here with ICANN, the US government, to give the US government credit, created something new. ICANN is a new process in international cooperation. But I would like to take maybe a step back a bit and ask you, Ada, give maybe a politician's take on all this, please.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Arda Gerkens. I'm a Dutch senator. And I must say, if I look at the multi-stakeholder process, it is actually a truly democratic process because you have all parties together looking at a problem to see how you can solve this together. And I actually think if one community could have pulled it off, it was the internet community, because you're still so close to all the self-regulations. When the internet started, the internet community basically all arranged everything itself. So it's very interesting to see what lessons we can learn from that. I think one word that I didn't hear yet is the word trust. I think trust is also a very important issue. If you extend the deadline for a year, you must trust the other party to solve this problem within a year too. I would very much hope that we could learn from this as politicians and start using this for exactly maybe mainly on internet or privacy issues, laws that are being made at this moment by my government, but other governments too, where the community thinks, well, why didn't you ask me for a solution? Because the way you're going now is not the right way. And we tend to think as politicians that we need to know the answers, but we need more and more, I think, especially around the internet, to sit down and talk to each other and let it go, let your power go and go and sit around the table and try to solve this together. Because I think the most important thing, although, is to have the main goal, to have a communal goal, or have a problem that you recognize, this is the problem, how are we going to solve it? If you have a different goal, then it will be problematic, and you can't even compromise. But if you have a mutual goal, I think you can. So I would really love to see how we can take the lessons learned from this transition, which, I mean, it's a big thing, right? It's not just a small situation. No, it's a big thing, this whole transition, and you pulled it off, which is wonderful. And we should really try to see if we can get that into more decision-making in the world, starting with politics.
Thank you very much for this take, and I think what you said is about the very democratic process, and I think the multi-stakeholder approach indeed is a participatory democratic process. And I would like to turn maybe to Grace, give maybe your perspective a bit as a newcomer to the ICANN world, and you also come from a country which has learned to introduce multi-stakeholder processes, and I was told even an article in the Kenyan constitution now stipulates the government consults stakeholders before taking decisions. But please, I'd like to hear from you, Grace.
Good morning. My name is Grace Mutungu. I work for the Kenya ICT Action Network, which is a multi-stakeholder space for people interested in ICT reforms in Kenya. And last year we did a study of, because KICTANet operates by a mailing list, so we did a study of what has been discussed on the mailing list over the past 10 years. Interestingly enough, there was a lot of discussion about ICANN over the 10 years, In fact, there was one thread which went something like Larry Strickling speaks or something like that. And the other interesting thing about it is that all the discussions on ICANN were led by or propelled by individuals. Some are from the private sector, others are from the civil society, but to a large extent, there is also some from the government, especially the communications regulator, but to a large extent, Kenya's participation in ICANN has been through individuals, and especially in civil society, it's through individuals and not through organizations. And as Marcus mentioned, in 2010 we had a change of constitution in Kenya, and one of the contributions from the ICT community was to push for public participation, and which is a form of multi-stakeholderism, and it was entrenched in the constitution, and it's a requirement that when any public body is making a decision, it has to consult the people who are affected by that decision. So this was somehow the influence of the ICT community, which has for a long time been practicing multi-stakeholderism to the constitution and nation building in Kenya. And in 2016, I was also doing a study on the case of .Africa, and I got interested and joined the non-commercial users constituency. And when looking at the case of .Africa, which was also widely discussed in Kenya, there was always the question of, well, fine, there's multi-stakeholderism, but does every stakeholder, does their input carry the same weight? As much as there's multi-stakeholderism, are all stakeholders, do they have the same capacity? Are they always at the table? And tying this back to the KICTANET study, it's actually a big capacity gap, especially with civil society voices who are always individuals, and without too much commitment and capacity building, they are not able to participate as effectively as other stakeholders. And to make it worse, in the developing world, internet governance is not usually one of the key priorities in society, because there are other competing interests. And from the IANA transition, we had, that's also around the time when there was a lot of advocacy for more of ICANN in Africa and more meaningful participation by Africans. So it was around the same time that ICANN opened an office in Nairobi. And so one really interesting and good lesson that I hope would be carried forward was that instead of the usual people going to ICANN, ICANN came to the people, and there were all these meetings and engagements with people to, just tell them in very simple terms, to educate them about what the transition was all about and how it affected them, and to get their input. And well, I think this is a very good thing. I think it would be more sustainable if it was done not by individuals, but by organizations. And so my parting shot would be that ICANN should consider working with organizations, especially in developing countries, to increase capacity and to increase participation, and to have more meaningful participation of people from developing regions in ICANN processes.
Thank you for that. And you have not mentioned the acronyms that make entry into the ICANN universe rather complex. But we don't have to go into that. Everybody recognizes that. But we've mentioned that when we had our chat yesterday. Laurie, please.
I wanted to add to that point about the acronyms, because it is, I think one of the challenges of applying the multi-stakeholder model outside of ICANN or in any environment is exactly that. Once you have a group of people who get together, who dedicate the amount of time and resources that those of us who are involved in ICANN do, you form your own language. You can't, I don't think that can be helped. It's part of how human beings function. You know, that we create our own cultures within bigger cultures. And ICANN itself is certainly a culture. But that being said, I think that is important when discussing multi-stakeholderism to make sure that it remains accessible. I mean, there are definite barriers to entry here. One is, to your point, Marcus, about acronyms inside any community, I think is a great example. But there's also, great investments of time, travel support. And I wanted to add something that I think ICANN does especially well, that we're the multi-stakeholder model to be exported to other problem-solving endeavors, that to ensure adequate literal support. ICANN always makes sure that we have technical support, whether that be through the use of Adobe Connect, other remote providers, translation into multiple languages, rotating times of meetings. I mean, there's a huge logistical piece of multi-stakeholderism that I think it's important to recognize, as well as the philosophical underpinnings.
Thank you. Can we go to our video? Okay.
Yes, because I want to add to Grace and Laurie. First of all, I think I know many governments have like processes in which they say that you have some kind of multi-stakeholder approach, which basically it's not. I mean, an internet consultation is not a multi-stakeholder approach. A meeting where you tell people what you're supposed to, or you're planning to do, and somebody else says, well, I don't agree, and say, okay, I do note it. It's not multi-stakeholder. So if you truly want to be multi-stakeholder, you should be open for every comment and make sure that process is there. And I totally agree with you, Laurie, and it's been said in the beginning, you need to make sure that everybody starts off at the same foot. So everybody needs to have the same funding, the same possibilities to meet and to join each other. And this is really crucial. Otherwise, we all know that the party with the most money will get, will influence that process and the outcome of the process, and then you still won't have the agreement you want to have. So that's something we really need to recognize.
Thank you, all valid points. Can we go to the video? Lilian, one of our panelists, she was supposed to attend remotely, but she cannot make it. But she has given us a video that also addresses some of these issues. Can you play the video, please?
I am Lilian.
Thank you, Lilian. She can't hear us, but nevertheless, you have taken note. And some of these questions have already been discussed, but there may be others who would like to react to that. And meanwhile, I also had an email from Mark Cavell, who was also supposed to be one of our panelists. He cannot be with us for family reasons, but he sends his greetings and wishes us good luck. Anyone would like to comment? Grace, please. Yes, please, of course.
Well, I wanted to pick up on our
Okay,
point
okay.
already made, but I can wait.
No, please.
So I want to come back to a point Artem made, which I think is incredibly important, and it's something that in the course of our interviews we saw this emerging, which is a certain confusion over what is actually a multi-stakeholder approach. The defining battle of internet governance over the last 15 years around the domain name system has been the question as to who gets to make the decisions that guide the evolution of the domain name system. Is it governments acting as governments, or is it the internet community, the global internet stakeholders? And what was at stake was who gets to make the decision. We are losing that concept as people continue to talk about the multi-stakeholder approach, and particularly in terms of applying it beyond the context of the domain name system. Too much of the debate today has now turned into one much more of, hey, it's multi-stakeholder participation in decision-making, but what that really is being defined by many governments as is simply having some consultation with stakeholders. That is a far different thing and a far weaker thing than what the battle has been about for the last 15 years. And I really urge everyone in the community to think about being as precise as they can when they talk about the multi-stakeholder approach, because this whole question of consensus-based outcomes implies that we are talking about bringing a group of people together who are going to reach a decision which then they would see implemented. Now, that's easily answered in the ICANN context because it's all built into the organization and the way it operates. But if you want to convene a group of stakeholders to talk about a broader question like the security issues in the Internet of Things, you are immediately faced with the question of, okay, so a group of people comes together, they reach a consensus, and then what happens? Who actually implements the outcome? And I think if we're going to expand the use of this approach, we have to ensure that the convenings that are taking place right from day one understand and define an outcome that is within the competencies of the parties to the discussion to actually implement. So it may drive us to things involving new business processes or best practices or codes of conduct that people can actually implement so that there's a change. Otherwise, I think one of the things the IANA transition proved is how time and resource intensive good multi-stakeholder discussions are. You are not going to get people to commit that level of resources if the outcome simply can go on a shelf somewhere and be ignored by the ultimate decision maker or implementer. And I think that for the community to say it's okay if all we get is a consultation, I think we are giving up way too much, way too soon in part of the larger global debate about internet governance, and we have to be very careful that we aren't sliding back into these notions that consultation is enough, because that's not what the multi-stakeholder model is based on, and that's not what I think takes advantage of the incredible power of getting lots of stakeholders with lots of viewpoints together to solve problems.
Thank you. We have a few people who would like to take the floor. Grace first, and then Matthew asked for the floor, and Aidan, yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to state that I did not specifically talk about the acronym problem, because I think it's always cliche to say, oh, ICANN is hard because of the acronyms, and it just sweeps under the carpet so many other bigger issues than the acronyms, because at the end of the day, with more outreach and the more ICANN is known to the people, the simpler it is to understand. And in any case, there are so many other parallels you can draw from how ICANN is structured that you don't necessarily need to know the acronyms to waddle through the complexity of the organization. So I think there are so many other issues that we oversimplify when we simply go with the cliche of acronyms is the problem with newcomers in ICANN. And I just also wanted to state that the thing I like about ICANN is that you can join the process. It's not just about consultation before decision making. There's also a chance to shape the decision, because you can join the process from the time the decision is being conceptualized to the time it's being negotiated to the time the decision is made and then implemented. There are so many opportunities along the way. And so for me, the biggest problem is just that if it's so open, why are there not enough people from all over the world or from so many other diversities? So it still comes back to the question of that we have conceptualized bringing in people as only bringing them to these physical meetings, and not giving enough support to make them participate in the other processes. For example, to participate in the calls, to participate in just taking time to learn about the history of ICANN or about other issues in ICANN. And this is why I think that it would make so much more sense to have organizations that work specifically on ICANN issues, the same way there are civil society organizations working on climate, the same way there are civil society organizations working on health, and so they're able to meaningfully participate in the processes at all the stages.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you also for introducing the concept of decision shaping, which is something which is dear to me, the distinction between decision shaping and decision making. As a Swiss citizen, collectively we had to make the painful learning experience when negotiating with the EU that you cannot take decisions if you're not a member, but you may be able to shape decisions. And the UK citizens in this room will learn the same experience. Matthew, you also wanted to comment.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. As a UK citizen, that's going to be an all too painful experience, I'm sure. Actually, I wanted to come back to, I just wanted to comment on what Grace said and then come back to something that Arda said, which I think is incredibly important. Grace, you mentioned the inclusiveness and the opportunity for engagement. I think that's absolutely right. From personal experience, it took me 3 ICANN meetings to really come up to speed and to be able to contribute. And the intensity of the IANA process was incredibly helpful, but that was a full-on, almost full-time engagement. But ICANN is doing a lot to reach out, and maybe Aidan can speak a bit to how organizations can participate as a part of, for example, of NCSG. But to Arda's point, I think we have to be really careful about this issue of multi-stakeholder rhetoric. There have been many occasions, just in the recent past and recent fora, where there have been claims of being multi-stakeholder where those clearly weren't multi-stakeholder. So we also have a responsibility as a community that's interested in promoting the multi-stakeholder model to continue to call out when it is not being appropriately implemented. And I would also say that there are many proponents of the multi-stakeholder model, but it's also important for those proponents, where no matter which stakeholder group they come from, to implement those multi-stakeholder processes. We do not have enough examples we can point to. It's very convenient to point to the IANA transition process, but that is something that's ingrained into our very nature. So it would be nice to see more multi-stakeholder processes, and we can talk about that hopefully a little bit, because there are some, but more multi-stakeholder processes being implemented by those who are proponents of multi-stakeholderism. Thanks.
Thank you. And Aidan asked, please, and introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Hi, my name is Aidan Bodolin. I'm stepping in today for Fazana Badi, who unfortunately cannot join us. For those of you who don't know me, I represent the non-commercial stakeholders group as a counselor on the Council of the Generic Name Supporting Organization. I just wanted to respond to a few things that I've heard. Firstly, by lending my support to the comments that Grace just made to do with language. There are challenges and barriers to participation in ICANN, but I don't accept that acronyms or having to learn a few words is a significant barrier. I cannot think of more than, say, 10 acronyms that I'm regularly exposed to at ICANN. But where there is a barrier is the structure that ICANN has adopted to fulfill its charter. That is complex. Those processes are obscure, and too few people have been able to figure out how to contribute meaningfully. But in any environment, any professional or social circle, you always need to learn the lingo to be able to participate meaningfully. On what was mentioned earlier about scale of participation, I agreed that on one end of the scale, if there is not full delegation of authority and there is merely a generic consultation process where you can speak but you're not necessarily heard, that is problematic, and I agree that it's not multi-stakeholder. And that is one of the questions that I have about ICANN processes in general, is that throughout ICANN's history, ICANN, the organization, ICANN, the board, has made it possible for people to submit formal comments on general or specific issues, to participate in working groups. And that participation can happen remotely. There is also the resources that are generously offered to bring people to meetings face to face. However, the extent to which this participation actually influences important decisions, I think, is less clear. And I think it is harder, aside from the IANA transition, but I think I think to say that there would be a level playing field where all voices are given equal weight would not be true. To the attributes that were identified earlier, I agree with all of them, that the hallmarks of a successful multi-stakeholder process, as Laurie Schulman mentioned, that it's stakeholder-driven, that it's open, that it's transparent, that there are consensus-based outcomes, fully agree. And I very much agree with Laurie as well when she mentioned that there has to be compromise and a form of implementation. But there are two other words that I would like to add that I think are essential to a effective multi-stakeholder process. And there are a few useful analogs to what ICANN is and to other organizations, but I think one is to a standards body, volunteer-driven effort, bottom-up processes. And in standard bodies, there tends to be shared responsibilities. So you manage to minimize this mismatch between the ends you're trying to achieve and the means that you go about it by having clearly defined responsibilities for the participating stakeholders. And secondly, I would just add recursivity, that the active use of multi-stakeholderism inevitably builds support and acceptance among those stakeholders, furthering their own confidence in their use of the approach. Thanks. I might leave my comments there for now.
Thank you, Fiden. And Keith, you wanted to add something?
Okay, thank you, Marcus. Yeah, so Keith Drazik. I'd like to come back to some of the comments made by Arda and Larry, references to self-regulation and government regulation and the tension between the two. I think Arda mentioned that we in the internet community have been successful in multi-stakeholder engagement because we've been closer to self-regulation because we're relatively new in the grand scheme of things. Larry mentioned that over the last 15 years, one of the big challenges within ICANN and the DNS policymaking is this tension between private sector, not meaning business necessarily, but non-governmental versus governmental regulation. And as we look ahead and try to take lessons from our experience in ICANN, I think it's important to recognize that there will be times where decisions that come out of a multi-stakeholder process conflict with government regulations. And we actually are seeing that in practice today. The example that I'll refer to, and I won't get into the specifics or the details, but just as a broad observation, with the GDPR and the conflicts with ICANN's current WHOIS policies. We have an example of a global policy for generic top-level domains developed in the global public interest through a formal policy development process in the ICANN space, multi-stakeholder bottom-up consensus-driven policymaking that appears now to be in conflict or at least have some challenges with the national regulations around GDPR. And so without going into a whole lot of detail there, I think one of the takeaways or the lessons is that as we engage in multi-stakeholder engagement and policymaking and decision-making, it's critical that we recognize early and often where there are possible conflicts with national laws. Not only existing national laws, but I think we need to be aware of the development of new regulations and where those may be in conflict with the policies that we've developed that are intended to apply globally in the public interest to our area of expertise. And so as we look ahead to future engagement and multi-stakeholderism outside the DNS, I guess my message or the lesson or the takeaway would be, we just need to be all very aware of where that tension is going to exist in a real world environment. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't think we want to turn this into a discussion on the GDPR, but I think it's and Laurie would like to jump in.
Yeah, I would, because we had discussed yesterday, I may raise this point, and I think piggybacking on GDPR might be a very good place. Yes, we have an issue now with having an open registrant information system where we can find out the names of who owns and contact information of who owns particular domain names, and that information could be used to transact business, that information could be used for enforcement, that information could be used to help settle a technical problem with the domain itself. So there's many uses for that open system. And now, to your point, very well taken, Keith, it's coming into conflict with trends across the world about how to protect personally identifiable information. And there are cross-border implications as well as just governmental versus non-governmental. So I wanted to raise a point here, which I think is an excellent example of how to solve a cross-border problem that has worked very well for 18 years for ICANN. And that's ICANN's first consensus policy on domain name disputes. The Uniform Domain Name Dispute Policy, the UDRP, known to many, is basically a bottom-up process that has developed over the course of time, where there was great concern among intellectual property owners, particularly trademark owners in this instance. And I didn't fully introduce myself. My name is Laurie Schulman. I am Senior Director for Internet Policy for the International Trademark Association. Our association is over 100 years old. We've been around much longer than the Internet, actually since 1848. And the roots of our organization were to advance the interests of trademark law and trademark owners to the extent that trademarks are rooted in consumer protection. That it is, to your point about trust, if we want to talk about origin and trust and understanding the source of information or products or services, a trademark is a way to do that. But when the domain name system was first developed and ICANN was formulated, and there were various papers produced, the white paper, the green paper, that came out of thinking from the United States government and the private sector about what do we do about this problem of abusing domain names in a trademark sense, and how can we possibly monitor this across 160 jurisdictions, and we understand there's all different types of cases. What do we do with the easiest cases, but the most egregious, the ones that may be giving consumers the most difficulty in terms of understanding what the source of a good or service may be online through the use of a domain name? So through that, a policy was developed through the multi-stakeholder model, which came up with the uniform dispute resolution process. And over the course of the 18 years, we've had contracted providers, WIPO being one of them, the Forum being another, that have actually implemented this policy, have independently recruited panelists, have independently created a body of law where now, if you file a UDRP, you have a reasonable prediction of an outcome. And that didn't necessarily mean giving up national sovereignty or moving away from national law. I think what makes the UDRP so unique is you can get a good result, but if the losing end on that result wants to, they can go file a national appeal and invoke national law. So you have this level of enforcement that says, hey, here's a system that's been developed bottom up, let's go use it. But if there's an inherent problem or we think the outcome is not fair, we can then go back and resort to national law. And thinking about the problems we're facing now with WHOIS, some content issues we're having, some security issues we're thinking about, having this middle layer between an institution like ICANN, but then a broader global solution for what is essentially private problems. To give that kind of a boost, I think would be important in terms of thinking about future questions. So I know from the intellectual property perspective, there's a lot of controversy within ICANN about what level of protection should or should not be afforded to certain types of intellectual property, trademarks being one, content, copyrighted content like films or music being another, or speech, political speech, of course. So that being said, I think, and I think most of the community would agree that the UDRP has worked very well. And one of the beauties of ICANN's policy development system and the multi-stakeholder model in terms of consensus building is periodically these decisions and processes are reviewed, and reviewed through mechanisms like ICANN's bylaws that mandate certain reviews. So right now, the UDRP will be under review as part of that process. But that being said, as someone who'd worked within this model since the beginning of the model, we can say over the course of 18 years it's developed well.
Thank you for that. So we had two broad threads in this discussion. Can we actually learn from the ANA transition? And you introduced a new element to UDRP to go forward also for ICANN. And the other one was, can we learn from the ANA transition and transpose that to other models of governance? So I really would like to draw on the expertise in the room and hear from all the people here. And there is a lot of expertise here. What is your take? And I mean, what can we do to improve within ICANN? What can we learn from past experience? Can we improve ICANN model? Or B, can we actually introduce the multi-stakeholder model, what we learned through the transition, to other areas? Jordan mentioned trade, and again, also with a very big resistance of governments actually giving up their privilege. And I think Ada also mentioned that it's always difficult for politicians to let go. She seems to be ready to let go if the necessary expertise comes in, but I'm not sure that all politicians would be ready to let go. And you confirm that. So I would be interested to hear from participants in the room. Steve, you have been a very active participant in the ANA transition. What can we learn?
Manal, too.
Manal, yes. Would you like to take the floor? Steve?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the notion of urgency would be an excellent ingredient to search for. So if we searched for another body that had multi-stakeholders engaged and found something urgent. Now, the urgency doesn't have to be a deadline. It could be solving a serious problem, the fake news issue, being concerned about cybersecurity, state actors and otherwise. So finding issues that have about them a sense of urgency through which a concerted action can lead to some conclusion, even if it's only just a convention or a series of best practices. It may not carry the implementation weight that policies do at ICANN with respect to domain names, but it could carry a lot of weight with respect to the way companies would represent their best practices in a way to inform consumers. So I think that we should cast about, and the IGF is a great place to find existential crises facing the internet. And if you're looking, Marcus, for areas outside of the internet, there's still a lot of those discussed here at IGF as well. But I think an urgency to solve a problem is where we should start looking.
Thank you for these comments, and I think cybersecurity is an excellent example. I think there is a lot of discussion going on, and there is a best practice forum on cybersecurity. You said only a convention. I'm not sure that the only is the justified description, but there is definitely, I think, maybe even a turning point that people feel the urgency that something ought to be done. But Manal, you wanted to? introduce yourself.
Is it working now? Okay, yes. So my name is Manal Ismail. I work for the Egyptian government and now also a GAC chair. But I participated in this process as the government of Egypt. So on the IANA transition, I think one of the things that made the process successful was prioritization as well, because it was a priority to everyone in the community, and everyone really concentrated on this specific issue. I think part of the problem is that too many things running in parallel, so people do not really progress and achieve and come with an output. So I think one point is prioritization of efforts so that the multi-stakeholder model can deliver. Because it was a very good demonstration that the multi-stakeholder model can deliver, and I think it was also one of the few processes that best utilized the multi-stakeholder nature of the organization. I usually think that despite the multi-stakeholder nature of ICANN, we don't necessarily usually work in a multi-stakeholder setup. I mean, each constituency works on its own, and then we start discussions bilaterally, then multilaterally, then cross-community. So probably this also takes more time. On the deadline thing, I think that as far as there is progress and the negotiations are going well, then we should allow some time for the discussions, because we have to appreciate the characteristics of the multi-stakeholder model, that it takes a little bit more time, but it delivers more quality and more credible output. So we should be able to decide whether the discussion has already stalled and we need then to agree on it.
So we're faced with this double problem.
A deadline so that we can draw a conclusion. And another keyword here
of sort of broad points on the issue. And I think maybe from a data protection,
consensusly agreeing that we're progressing, so we should allow more time. We're not progressing, so we should try to conclude. And if we're going to
view, it's clearer from going right back to the 1980s, the early 1980s, that the
impose a deadline. Again, this should be agreed within the community. So this is another keyword.
These new technology companies, whether that's digital archives or going on to search engines and platforms, do have enormous power, and their activities create an awful lot of good things.
Consensusly agree on whatever action we are going to do next. And also one final thing is breaking things down into maybe phases.
Also do create very, very real negative effects on people, and
or smaller problems so that we can progress faster as well. So
it's appropriate, I think, for that to be looked at by society and for solutions to be looked at. So I don't think we should.
And breaking things down, maybe. Thank you.
Of that. And the second thing I would say is that we do need to be a bit careful that we don't misdescribe incentives. These companies do have a great incentive to
Thank you. And we talk quite a lot about the uniqueness of the IANA transition in terms of sense of urgency and window of opportunity. It was not an artificial deadline. It was just a
disseminate an awful lot of information, whether that's harmful or not harmful. And also, I would say that, as an aside, also an intellectual
opportunity that needed to be exploited. So that, I think, cannot be repeated easily.
An incentive to provide the material, even if it's questionably legal, because they are the go-to point. But again, that might produce many, many social costs.
This was a macro political situation which was there, a window of opportunity, and the community seized the opportunity and felt a common sense of.
We need precise regulation with precise responsibilities, with good accountability mechanisms. But that
all the other things that you say is that we have a common understanding of the deadline, I think.
Or self-regulation that is incredibly weak. We need effective regulation.
Is important. But I think maybe the most important point you made was that ICANN use.
Thank you. And so I think I just want to pick up one or two issues that were mentioned. One is the one about incentives that both you and Luca mentioned. And the other one is about accountability. So these platforms
usually works in silos, and the ANA transition helped to break down the silos. My question is there anything we can learn from that going forward? I heard a comment made.
Duty to their shareholders to maximize revenues. So they are. That's why they are.
PDPs are bad. Cross-community working groups are good, and I think
going to adopt the least expensive measures, the least sophisticated sorts of measures, and I think what we should do in our discussion, maybe as a task for next year, you know, develop.
May not be as simple as that, but. Is there something that can be learned? And I look here at, there are representatives on the GNSO Council. I don't know what you would like to say, but there are people.
As of how accountability can be injected into the corporate culture of.
In the room who are intimately involved, and I see one of ICANN board member, Leon, please.
So that, you know, they will have to recognize to their stakeholders that some.
Thank you, Marcos. Leon Sanchez. I think
some of these measures need to be taken. They're part of the simply the due diligence that corporations should embrace as part of their role in the society. As a
at least for me, is that early engagement and active participation is key to actually achieving consensus. During the transition, we saw many efforts.
To what we have done in previous years. Yesterday we had a meeting amongst the authors of the book and
that were navigating towards one direction, and then at some point
we thought about things that could be done over the course of the next year, because this should be a dynamic coalition, not a static one. So the idea is that, you know, we are now brainstorming about possible projects, and you
would dive into this effort and just swift away to another completely different direction. But I believe that that was maybe consequence of.
Welcome to approach us after the session, and one of the focuses might indeed be about
not engaging and not participating actively in a timely fashion. But then when
about this accountability role of platforms. There's two last quick comments that maybe we can have.
Actors began participating actively and engaging with the rest of the community.
Thank you. Just wanted to make two small points. The first one is it's true that there needs to be an accountability on platforms, but what we see is that a lack of accountability and responsibility.
That we were synchronized in some sort of way, then the way or the course of the efforts were better.
Responsibility by the other parties involved in this whole counter-regulation environment, such as governments, but also
they're driven. So I guess that for me the key learning of this is, as Mal
involved as trusted flaggers, like who, for example, there have been some cases where governments and legislators are not actually keeping any statistics. They just
working out of silos, but also engaging and actively participating early on the different processes within ICANN.
Concentrate on the big news of, for example, Facebook have removed X number.
Also, I've said that you're one of the 3 co-chairs of the help to bring down a transition.
Yeah. That's the case. So out of that, how many investigations have led, to, for example, any prosecution?
Keith first, or Matthew?
Thanks, Marcus. I'd like to come back to some...
We're actually talking, for example, about terrorist crimes. Is there any diligence there? And the answer we're seeing is that there's no diligence whatsoever. So we see that there needs to be an accountability and responsibility.
Thing that Steve said, because I think he's touched on a really important point. We have to recognize that ICANN is a unique entity, and its processes and its policy making is quite unique as well.
And the second point is that instead of seeing a trend of self-regulation,
what called a model can transcend that and move and can be placed into other spaces, but it requires a significant
is privatized law enforcement. So it's not self-regulation by platforms because
amount of effort to implement. And I think so. I liked Steve's idea that perhaps we need to think about how,
because they're not deciding that, you know, because they think that they need to fight child abuse or terrorism, that they do it. They're really facing political pressure. It is not new, as it's been said already by my colleague.
Multi-stakeholder processes to new issues, where there aren't ingrained policy processes already to deal with some outstanding issue that may have taken 3 or 4 years so far. And in that sense,
it's actually been there for a long time, so we need to ensure that there's a counterbalancing obligation by these companies.
The area of cybersecurity is ripe for that, because everybody recognizes, I think, that this is these are systemic and holistic.
To respect human rights, and I think in this sense, recommendations, for example, from the Council of Europe and also from the magnificent work from David Kay also shed some light in this direction. Thanks.
Thank you. And
by a cross-section of stakeholders. So I think these new issue areas where there's an opportunity for stakeholders to come together and bring new experience and new approaches, but based upon a multi-stakeholder process.
The way David Kay has issued a call for submissions on the topic of content regulation and digital
is an attractive idea, and I think that's something that we should be actively pursuing as a community.
Age, which is open until today, I think, or tomorrow, so you're still in time.
Yes, perfect.
Comment, Rolf?
Well, I just wanted to quickly respond to David, and in particular to his presentation topic. I think we experienced consequently.
Yes, Keith. Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Marcus. Keith Drazik. So I think we're bouncing around a little bit, but I want to go back to your very provocative question.
To the Google Spain case, that it is not only ideal to move all responsibility
between CCWGs and PDPs
to the provider. I mean, Google has installed a huge administration for looking at the right to be forgotten issues. I don't feel pity for Google, but nevertheless, we have to see we cause substantial social costs, and we make a private.
You here might be wondering, you know, if there is so much algorithmic governance, so much algorithmic online content regulation, why not just take academics and, you know, have them look at algorithms, you know, which one is a good algorithm, which one is a bad algorithm? Well, it is actually highly problematic because, first of all, it's not just an issue of transparency that those algorithms are kept in secrets. They are often a business asset. In case of YouTube, the content filtering mechanism there, I think Google spent $80 million developing it. But also another problem with those algorithms is in the age of big data, those algorithms are now constantly changing. Mm-hmm. YouTube's content filtering algorithm changes every hour. Before I kind of, you know, even arrange my notes properly, it will be different. So that's a very, very difficult and challenging thing in this regard, and why we need to look elsewhere oftentimes. Thank you.
Okay, with this injection of optimism regarding algorithms, I think we can close the meeting. Thank you very much. If you want to make suggestions on the future works, we have a mailing list. Unfortunately, that has not been blocked by the MAG yet, so I invite you to use it. If you don't find information on the very Byzantine IGF website, you can just put in your browser tinyurl.com/UNIGF platforms, and you will arrive directly on the page of the Dynamic Coalition with more information and the address of the mailing list. Thank you very much to everyone.
only 20 minutes.
No, poi poi uno può stare in sala.
Per fortuna, dai.
How are you doing? Hi. You have an extra copy. I might have, so close to that red bag, there might be 2 or 3 extra copies that are for you if you want. Yes. Run.
Another one? So I think we have them, but we'll have to distribute them at the DC booth. So later on, following this session. Yeah, booth of Dynamic Coalition. I will be there. Yes.
Great,
Yes.
because I didn't manage to get it.
Oh, no, you didn't. But do we still have copies here? Maybe one, but yeah, let's see if we're lucky.
Okay.
Yeah, we hope that you can contribute for next year. Yeah.
Oh, I'm not trying.
Do it?
Yeah, I had so many deadlines. I actually had it on my to-do, and then I said, I can't do it.
I know, yes.
You know how it is.
Academic life, yes. Thank you very much. A pleasure. I think you have some suggestions on accountability, so maybe we can continue the conversation for what we're going to do next year.
I have one.
The
I
idea is to
think
develop
all the
some
other
things for
authors too.
accountability.
So I think you can distribute those.
That's why I didn't mention the agency. Yes.